What's a good way to start making comics? This is, again, going to be something that is very individual. It's going to vary for each person, but I can tell you how I got started making comics, and maybe something in there will spring to your mind and you'll be like, oh, that's interesting. I kind of want to try that. And then you'll try it and you'll see if it works for you. And if it does, great. If it doesn't, you move on and you try something different. I started making comics when I was a wee bab. I started in like middle school. I made my very first comics in like 4th grade, but I didn't start getting serious, quote, serious about it until like 6th grade. And so what I used to do is I was very into 2 series at the time. There were 2 comics that I adored back then that kind of kickstarted my love of comics in general. One of them was a 4-panel manga called Ozymandias, and one was Calvin and Hobbes. So my inspiration for comics came from a weird amalgamation of those 2 series. And both of those comics are gag comic strips. And so I thought, oh, especially with Ozymandias. Ozymandias is a slice of life comedy series about girls in high school that just like say and do silly things. And then you get to watch. And so I said, hey, my friends like to say and do silly things. What if I use those things that my friends like to say and do and I make comics out of them? And so what I did was whenever something funny would happen amongst my group of friends, I would take what happened and I would make a little comic about it. And then I would go around and I would show it to all my friends, like for the rest of the day. And I would be like, hey, look at this silly funny thing that happened earlier. You missed it, but I made a comic about it. Here, I can show you. Or you remember this silly thing that you did earlier today? I made a comic about it. Look, that's you. And that was so good for me because getting to show people the comic strips I made, like immediately, people are interested because it's stories about them and people they know. And I get the immediate feedback of, oh, that's fun, it's us, look, this is a silly thing that happened, I love this. And I had people to show immediately. I had a built-in audience of just my little group of friends. And then I had motivation to keep making them because they were giving me positive feedback and like they were really excited to get comics that were about them. All of middle school, basically, I just made so many comics. Just like little comics about dumb shit my friends did. In the grand scheme of things, they didn't mean anything. It was not high art. These were not masterpieces. These were just like weird, dumb little sketches in my sketchbook. But you know what those were? Practice for what was to come. Because I was learning and I wasn't even thinking about it. I was learning how to tell a joke. I was learning how to use the visual medium to its advantages to get the reactions that I wanted. I was learning about paneling. I was learning about composition. I was learning how to show things. And I was learning how to tell a story in this visual medium. But I wasn't focused on that. I was just having fun with it. I was just drawing silly things for my friends. But those dumb little comic scripts were the equivalent of like starting with your little tiny dumbbells and lifting weights. Because then a couple years later, when I decided that I wanted to try making longer form stories and making web comics and like actually writing longer stories with comics, I already had so much practice with comics as a medium because I spent years and years making these dumb, silly little comics. And that was just like the foundation. That was the building blocks. I was learning the basics by just goofing off and having fun with my friends so that then when I actually wanted to apply those skills to something bigger, I knew how to do that because I'd spent all that time making the silly little comics. I had spent so much time lifting weights that when I actually wanted to do like a sport, like a proper sport, I already had the muscle mass. Does that make sense? If you want to start any creative endeavor that requires a skill, learning the basics in a low stakes way is always going to be easier, 1, and 2, less likely to scare you off. It's going to be a lot easier to start small than it is to try and jump into something huge. Like, I know that there's a lot of talk back and forth. If you're interested in making a webcomic, should you make that comic or should you do something else first? And this is a contentious topic and a lot of my friends have differing views on it. But what I would suggest, it's like if you want to start knitting, you could try and knit a sweater for your very first knitting project. You're probably not going to finish the sweater. The sweater's probably not going to be very well made. You might have some holes. It might not fit very well. The string tension might be all over the place. It might be a little bit of a mess. And you might get discouraged and you might not finish it. If you're okay with that, then make the sweater. Like, no one's gonna stop you from making the sweater. If you want to pick up a pair of knitting needles for this first time and say, I'm gonna make a sweater, and you're okay with the understanding that you might not finish the sweater might be a little wacky. You might go back and wish, man, I wish I had started with something well. You can just make the sweater. There's no knitting police that's gonna come in and say you can't make a sweater as your first project. I'm not gonna be the knitting police. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna say, hey, it's really great that you wanna make a sweater. That is fantastic. Maybe learn some basic stitches first. Maybe like just make some little like knitted coasters. Make like a scarf. Make something easy that you can just finish. And what that means in comics is gonna be like, maybe your first time making comics, maybe you just make some dumb little comic scripts. Maybe you make just like a little one shot. Maybe you take the blorbos that you want to use in your webcomic and you just make a couple of like little one-off comics. You make just like a little short story. You make a comic about a character's tragic backstory. You make a comic about how these two characters met. You cut your teeth on the small stuff so that when you're ready to take the step towards actually making the big comic, when you are ready to knit that sweater, you'll have the skills under your belt to know how to do a good job. I'm not going to stop you from making a sweater as your very first thing. God forbid, I never want to stop someone from making a comic. Just be aware that it's pretty common. Your first attempt at a new medium might be a little bit shaky. Your first steps on this earth as a human being were going to be shaky. No one's good at something their first time doing it. If you think you're going to get discouraged by that, maybe start with something smaller. If you're just super gung-ho and you just want to jump right in feet first into the deep end, I will not stop you. Godspeed, you beautiful nerd. I also find that like doing some of the smaller stuff will help you figure out if you even like making comics. Because I've seen it happen before where someone, you know, goes gung-ho into making comics for like 6 months and then figures out that they don't actually like it that much. They like the idea of making comics, but maybe the actual act of making comics isn't for them. And it's a lot easier and less emotionally tormenting to figure that out on something smaller and lower stakes first, you know? I will never stop you from jumping into the deep end, but maybe learn how to swim first. That's just my advice. That's my take on it.